My name is Daniel Marsh, and for 31 years, I believed my father hated me for no reason at all. I thought I was simply born difficult to love. It wasn't until the night he lay dying in a hospital bed in Manchester that I learned the truth. A truth so ugly it would have been kinder if he'd taken it to his grave. But let me start from the beginning because you need to understand exactly how deep this betrayal ran before I tell you how it ended. I was 6 years old the first time I noticed my father looked at me differently than he looked at my younger sister Emily. We'd be sitting at the dinner table, and he'd reach over and ruffle her hair, tell her she was clever, tell her she had her mother's eyes. When he looked at me, his jaw would tighten. He'd find something else to focus on. His plate, the television, anything but my face. I used to think I'd done something wrong. Children always do. We assume the world revolves around our behavior. So if a parent pulls away, we search ourselves for the flaw that caused it. I stopped raising my hand in school assemblies because I thought maybe he didn't like attention seekers. I stopped asking for hugs because I thought maybe I asked for too much. By the time I was 10, I'd made myself as small and quiet as I possibly could, hoping that if I simply took up less space, my father might finally look at me the way he looked at Emily. It never worked. My mother, Susan, tried to compensate. She was warm where he was cold, present where he was absent. She'd sit with me at the kitchen table doing homework long after Emily had gone to bed. And I remember asking her once when I was about 11, "Mom, why doesn't Dad like me?" She went very still. I remember that stillness more than I remember her actual answer, which was something vague about how fathers show love differently, how some men aren't good with words. I believed her because I wanted to. Children will believe almost anything if the alternative is unbearable. The distance between my father and me only grew as I got older. He came to Emily's netball matches without fail. He missed most of my school events, citing work, citing traffic, citing anything that sounded plausible enough that I couldn't call it out directly. When I made the football team in secondary school, he shook my hand instead of hugging me like I was a colleague he was congratulating on a promotion rather than a son he was proud of. I want to be clear about something. My father wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He never hit me. He never screamed at me. If you'd met him at a pub or a barbecue, you'd have thought he was a perfectly ordinary, perfectly pleasant man. His cruelty was quieter than that. 1,000 small withdrawals, 1,000 moments where warmth was available and he simply chose not to give it to me. That kind of cruelty is almost harder to name, because there's no bruise to point to, no raised voice to report. Just an absence year after year that shapes a child from the inside out. By the time I left for university at 18, I had convinced myself that I simply wasn't the kind of person my father could love. I carried that belief into every relationship I had afterward. I dated women and unconsciously waited for them to pull away the way he had. I struggled in my early career to accept praise from managers, always half expecting it to be retracted. A father's rejection doesn't stay contained in childhood. It follows you. It sits in the passenger seat of every decision you make as an adult, whispering that you are, at your core, someone difficult to love. I moved to London after university and built a life there. A flat in Clapham, a job in marketing I was good at, and eventually a fiancée named Rachel who loved me with a steadiness I still sometimes couldn't quite trust. I saw my parents twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, and each visit was the same. My father's polite distance, my mother's overcompensating warmth, and Emily, oblivious to the whole dynamic, chattering happily about her own life. I was 31 when I got the call from my mother that my father had collapsed at work. A heart attack, sudden and severe. By the time I got the train up to Manchester, he was in intensive care, stable but weak, and the doctors were using words like "we'll monitor him closely" in that careful tone that means they don't yet know if someone will live. I sat by his hospital bed that first night, and I remember feeling an emotion I wasn't proud of. Obligation without love. I was there because you're supposed to be there when your father is dying, not because some part of me ached with the fear of losing him. That realization sat heavy in my chest. 31 years old, and I couldn't locate genuine love for the man who'd raised me. Only duty, and beneath the duty, an old familiar hurt. He drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. My mother barely left his side, and Emily flew in from Edinburgh, where she'd been living for work. On the third night it was just my father and me in the room. My mother had finally gone home to sleep, and Emily had stepped out for coffee. The machines beeped steadily beside his bed. His eyes opened, found mine, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in them I didn't recognize. Fear, and underneath the fear, something that looked almost like the beginning of an apology. "Daniel," he said, his voice thin and cracked. "There's something I need to tell you. I should have told you a long time ago." I leaned forward, some old buried part of me still hoping that whatever came next would finally explain away 31 years of distance with something forgivable. A childhood wound of his own. A fear he'd never worked through. Something human. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "when you were 3 days old? Before we brought you home?" I shook my head. Of course I didn't remember. No one remembers being 3 days old. "There was another baby in the hospital nursery," he said. "Born the same week as you. A mix-up with the bassinets. The nurses had switched name tags during a shift change. Your mother and I brought home a baby we believed was ours. We loved him. We named him Daniel. We raised him as our son for 4 months before anyone noticed the error." I felt the room tilt slightly. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," my father continued, each word costing him visible effort, "that when the hospital called and told us there'd been a mix-up, that the boy we'd been raising wasn't biologically ours, and that our actual biological son was living with another family, your mother and I had to make a choice. The other family had grown attached too. There were solicitors, custody discussions. In the end, everyone agreed it would be too traumatic to swap the babies back after 4 months of bonding. So we kept you. Legally, officially, in every practical sense, you became our son." I sat frozen, my mind struggling to process what he was telling me. "But something in me never let go of it," he said. And here his eyes finally filled with tears. "Every time I looked at you, I saw the reminder. Not that you'd done anything wrong, you never did anything wrong, Daniel, not once, but that you weren't the boy who was supposed to be mine. I told myself it shouldn't matter. I told myself love isn't about blood. But I couldn't make my heart follow what my head knew was right. And so I pulled away from you for 31 years, for a mistake that was never yours to carry. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember what I said in that moment, if I said anything at all. What I remember is the roaring silence in my own head. The sudden, sickening reframing of my entire childhood. Every missed football match. Every stiff handshake instead of a hug. Every time I'd searched my own face in the mirror wondering what was wrong with me. None of it had ever been about me at all. It had been about a mistake made by hospital staff when I was 3 days old, and a grown man's inability to separate a technicality from the child in front of him. "You were never my son," he whispered. Not cruelly, I understood later, but as a confession, a truth he'd swallowed for 3 decades finally forcing its way out. Not by blood. But God help me, Daniel. You were the only son I ever had. I left the hospital room that night and didn't come back for 2 days. I sat in my mother's kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd done homework as a boy while she sat beside me, compensating for a father who couldn't. I asked her if she'd known. She had. She'd known since I was 4 months old. She told me, through tears, that she'd made her peace with it almost immediately, that from the moment she held me, biology stopped mattering to her. And she'd spent 31 years trying to be enough love for 2 parents because she watched my father struggle with something she couldn't fix for him. I begged him, she said. For years I begged him to let it go. To just love you the way you deserved. I'm so sorry, Daniel. I should have protected you from this better than I did. I want to tell you that this story has a clean, satisfying resolution, that my father recovered, and we sat down and healed 31 years of damage in one long conversation. Real life rarely works that neatly. He did recover physically. The heart attack in the end wasn't fatal. But the conversation we had that night in the hospital changed something permanent between us. I won't pretend it was all repaired. 31 years of a child quietly believing he was unlovable doesn't dissolve because the reason finally makes sense. If anything, learning the reason brought its own grief for the boy I'd been, who'd spent his whole childhood absorbing blame that was never his. But something did shift. In the months that followed, my father tried, in his stiff, imperfect way, to close the distance he'd spent 3 decades building. He called more. He asked about Rachel, about my work, about things that had nothing to do with obligation. At my wedding the following spring, he gave a toast, and for the first time in my life, I watched him cry openly in front of other people, saying that he'd wasted years being loyal to a fear instead of being loyal to his son. I've thought a great deal since that night about what it means to actually be someone's family. Blood, it turns out, was never the thing standing between my father and me. What stood between us was his refusal to let go of a version of the story where I was somehow less his because of circumstances neither of us had any control over. I didn't choose to be switched at birth. He didn't choose it either. But he chose every single day for 31 years how he responded to it. And for most of those years, he chose distance over the child who was right in front of him, desperate for his attention. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you had to earn a parent's love like affection was something conditional, something you might lose if you weren't careful enough, good enough, quiet enough, I want you to hear this. That was never about your worth. It was almost always about something broken in the person withholding it, something they never worked through, something they let define you instead of confronting in themselves. My father and I are not what I'd call close even now. But we are, for the first time in my adult life, honest with each other. And somehow that honesty, as painful as it was to arrive at, has given me something 31 years of silence never could. The truth. Not a comforting truth. Not an easy one. But mine finally to understand. I still think sometimes about that other baby, the biological son my parents gave up in those 4 months, who grew up in another family, living a life that was, by some accident of hospital paperwork, originally meant to be mine. I don't know his name. I don't know if he ever learned the truth about his own first months of life. Part of me hopes he grew up in a home where he was loved without hesitation, without the shadow of comparison. He deserved that. So, in the end, did I? Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever had to unlearn the belief that you were somehow unlovable because of something entirely outside your control, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it too.